Emma, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I don't know what was happening. My computer audio wasn't working. I'm switched to my phone.
Okay, yep, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, good, thank you. And Emma, are we seeing the presentation slide?
Yep, it looks like it's in perfect presenter mode.
Okay, thank you.
Will the slides be available online somewhere at a later date?
Yes, we do intend to leave these with the Water Resources Center so that they can keep it online.
Thank you.
And Emma, again, I can't see when I'm in presentation mode any of the participants, so I don't know who all's on yet, whether our host is on or if we have or how many people are on. Should we wait more?
I think let's say a couple more minutes. We do have 17 people on, but there are a few people that are still joining.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks everyone for being on time. It's for this presentation, and we'll give it just a couple more minutes to get started after we get a few more people on and it slows down. Dr. Mulla, are you on?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we have 21 people on. It looks like it's slowing down with people coming in, so I think we can probably get started.
Okay, and do we have someone from the Water Resource Center on? Again, I can't see the participant list. Okay, doesn't sound like it, so but we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us at this presentation on the PV Smart project. We did present last month on SolSmart, and we touched on some of this information that we're going to cover today about large-scale solar and water water quality issues. But we're going to dive pretty deep today into the work that we have done over the last 2.5 years on the PV Smart project, and give people an opportunity to kind of ask some questions of the field research and the modeling and the detailed results. What we're going to do today is, after our welcome, is to I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Brian Ross with the Great Plains Institute. Great Plains Institute is a nonprofit organization that does work on decarbonizing our energy system. We're based out of Minneapolis, but we work regionally and nationally on a variety of different issues. The work the program that I'm in charge of at GPI is the Renewable Energy Program, and we have been working nationally on a variety of issues around solar deployment and integration with natural resources and community resources. And this is a project that we'll describe that we're working on with a variety of different partners. My colleague Emma Parkson is going to be managing the logistics here, and my co-presenter, Dr. Mola, will be handling the field testing, measurement, and the modeling questions. I'll do the introduction of the actual project and to talk about the context of why this is an important issue that you guys in Pennsylvania need to be attending to, and then we will. After Dr. Mola presents, I will finish with kind of what we're doing with these modeling impacts and field results in terms of developing best practices and guidance documents. So the PV Smart project, which is the photovoltaic stormwater management research and testing program, was started about 2.5 years ago. It is a DOE-funded, Department of Energy-funded project. The partners in it are the University of Minnesota, who is doing all of the technical work, field research, and modeling. Great Plains Institute, my organization, is doing the implementation of that and assessing regulatory and permitting issues and how the field research is integrated into that. Fresh Energy is doing some of the communications around the program, and the program is being managed overall by the National Renewable Energy Lab out of Golden, Colorado. So the problem that we're trying to get to with this PV Smart project is that as the solar market started heating up and we started to see development across the country, we discovered that there were a lot of jurisdictions that were treating ground-mounted PV facilities as predominantly impervious surface in the local stormwater and sometimes the state stormwater regulations and water quality, various other water quality permitting. We'd also discovered that most of the models being used by local and state jurisdictions had not been tailored to solar development, which has some unique characteristics that are different from other kinds of development. And instead, the kind of regulatory and permitting processes were being tailored to non-solar research or findings. The outcome of that was that there was a lot of uncertainty around how permitting would move forward, and we were getting significantly different requirements across jurisdictions, leading to a slower deployment of solar and frequently suboptimal water quality outcomes on top of that. We do have a very large amount of solar, as is noted in the left there, that has been proposed to be connected to the grid. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab did a study of the entire nation and discovered over 462 gigawatts of large-scale solar projects that had been requesting connection to the grid. And just to put some context on that, the existing amount of large-scale projects across the entire nation and all of our history is 47 gigawatts. So it's almost 10 times the amount of the existing deployment that we've seen that has been proposed in the marketplace to connect to the grid. Now, most of that won't be developed for a variety of reasons, but it's an indication of the market and where we're going with solar energy. If developed, that amount of solar would be about 3.7 million acres of land, and most of it would be in rural watersheds because that's where solar farms tend to be developed. In Pennsylvania specifically, we did take a look at what was already kind of capable of being developed and being proposed. We did look at the at the large-scale renewable energy resource that is in Pennsylvania, and interestingly, you can see that most of the state is in the very lowest category of potential production. But nevertheless, this is still plenty of resource that is economic that will result in significant development in the state. So don't be fooled by the category there. We do have the Southwest Pennsylvania area commission area kind of noted in a blue line over there in the lower left. And if we zoom in on that, we can see kind of what it looks like and kind of where the solar resources are. But most importantly, when we look at just Pennsylvania in terms of proposed projects, there are currently about 17,000 megawatts or 17 gigawatts of proposed large-scale projects, which is 10 times the amount of total solar installed in the state as of the end of 2021. So again, it's the same kind of scale of proposed projects in Pennsylvania as we are seeing nationally. Of the 17 gigawatts that have been proposed, about almost 3 gigawatts or 2,800 megawatts of solar projects are just in the Southwest Pennsylvania Commission area. If all of those were developed, and of course they won't all be developed, but over the long run, we will see that kind of development occur. It's about 25,000 acres of land, which is a lot of land and something that people who are concerned about water quality obviously would be interested in seeing that it's done in a way that facilitates optimal water quality or improved water quality outcomes. It isn't a lot of land total. Even if all of these projects were built, most of the counties would probably have less than 0.5% of their total land in solar development. But on a localized basis, since these developments do come in hundreds or sometimes even thousands of acres of size, it can be significant and it still needs to be considered. Here's just a quick breakdown of what you're seeing county by county in the Southwest region. And you can see that there is a great deal of variation among the counties in terms of proposed projects. We do expect to see over time increasing amounts of projects proposed in all of the counties. But right now we're seeing Lawrence County, of course, with the single largest amount of proposed projects in the queue. And this is data that was current as of March of 2022. So ultimately, what we look at with all this market development of solar is that there's a great deal of uncertainty for the industry in stormwater and water quality permitting processes because there were not solar-specific guidance documents or best practices or opportunities to even model what the impacts would be, and which has from the industry standpoint increases what we call the development soft costs of putting solar on the ground. From the water quality regulator standpoint, the lack of tested BMPs and established solar-specific runoff coefficients would lead to a precautionary approach in the permitting, where there might be, if you're in doubt, you're going to ask for more rather than less, which is a suboptimal circumstance. And so we're also seeing an opportunity here to kind of increase the ability of water quality regulators to really get to the point where they want to about protecting and possibly even improving water quality in impaired waters or impacted watersheds. So this project was initially designed to reduce the kind of soft costs associated with stormwater infrastructure requirements from the standpoint of the solar industry. That's why DOE is funding it, but also to improve water quality outcomes. And we are going to be developing and disseminating, as a result of this, research-based solar-specific resources for estimating stormwater runoff and developing best practices for stormwater management as well as water quality management at ground-mounted PV facilities. As a result of this project, we have established a national water quality task force to kind of oversee the project and provide us with feedback from a variety of perspectives on the research. We've conducted field research and done 3D modeling, which Dr. Mola is going to describe in much more detail. We have developed already some interim stormwater water quality best practices based on interim results of the field testing. And we have been engaging with local jurisdictions and state jurisdictions to disseminate the best practices in stormwater runoff coefficients and make sure that everybody's comfortable with this research that's coming out and what it means in the water quality world. Our water quality task force, as you can see here, includes national water quality entities, including a couple of people from the EPA, as well as advocates such as the Center for Watershed Protection, who are primarily interested in water quality, and then solar industry people as well, who are primarily interested, of course, in solar development and in facilitating that. And we also have several state regulators and some local representatives, as well as some consultants who work for developers and for water quality entities, and some academics on the committee as well. So I'm going to, at this point, hopefully that's enough background, and I want to hand it over to Dr. Mola to go over the field research and the modeling results that we have thus far. So I will stop sharing, David, and you can take over.
Thank you, Brian. Hopefully you can see my screen. And
not yet.
Okay. Tell me when.
Okay, that looks good.
All right. So I'm a professor in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. I'm at the University of Minnesota. And I've been working with my staff person, Jake Galsky, to do some modeling of runoff at 5 solar research sites across the country. So we're trying to develop and disseminate best practices for reducing stormwater runoff at ground-mounted PV facilities. We have sites in Minnesota, Colorado, Oregon, New York, and Georgia. And we want to develop a calculator to estimate runoff based on the design, the climate, the soil and topographic characteristics, and the surface cover. And we have variations in all of these at our sites. We have fixed and tracking arrays. We have wetter climates, drier climates. We have sandy soils, clay soils, and we have a range of different kinds of vegetation. So here are some photos of our sites. Minnesota in the upper left, Oregon in the upper right, New York in the lower left, Georgia in the lower right. And they all vary considerably. So New York is a fixed array. It has a hydrologic D soil with grass and clover. Part of it is grazed with sheep, another part is ungrazed. It's relatively wet. And then Georgia is a tracking array on flat hydrologic group B soil with 2 different kinds of vegetation and also very wet. Minnesota is a fixed array. It's a hydrologic group A soil, a little bit steeper with a pollinator mix and moderate rainfall. And then Oregon and Colorado are relatively arid. They're both clay soils, and they have pollinator vegetation. So we have a monitoring system at these sites where we're trying to capture the three-dimensional nature of the disconnected impervious surfaces. So we have impervious arrays that intercept rainfall. The rain runs off the drip edge, infiltrates, runs off, goes down slope where it's intercepted by vegetation, and then that vegetation transpires some of the water under the arrays, even though the arrays themselves are impervious. Underneath the arrays, we have soil that's capable of infiltrating water that runs off from upslope. So we need to address that. We're measuring rain under the open sky. And at the fixed array sites, we're also measuring the runoff from the edges of the panels. We have soil moisture probes installed under the arrays, under the drip edge, and in the full sun area. And this is what we're using to calibrate and validate our models. We're characterizing the sites using moisture probes and infiltrometers. We have topography, soils, climate. We have some measures of vegetation density and rooting depth. And we're getting at soil texture and bulk density through measurements. The model we're using is called Hydrus 3D, and it's a numerical model. And we have to input things like soil depth, soil texture, soil bulk density, some of the soil properties, the slope. And then we assume for the beginning of our simulation that we're at field capacity. And we input measured design storms for the different regions. We have measured the amount of runoff at the drip edge, and so we can account for that in terms of our modeling. And the runoff at the drip edge ranges from about 5 to 10 times the precipitation. Obviously, there's no direct precipitation hitting the area under a flat array. And if there's vertical rainfall, so we account for that. And we also have the ability to handle tilted arrays where the wind would be blowing from one side or the other, and then for affecting the amount of precipitation that hits underneath the area that would typically be under the arrays. We need these soil hydraulic properties that are shown in the graphs. And so we need the relationships between water content and pressure head, which varies by soil texture, and the relationship between hydraulic head and hydraulic conductivity. And we're able to basically get that kind of information through calibration of our models. We have evaluated the accuracy of our models from the 5 sites by adjusting the saturated hydraulic conductivity when necessary. We always start out with the measured hydraulic conductivity. And we also adjust the alpha and N parameters in the soil hydraulic property curves that I showed on the previous slide. So here's an example of some of our calibration work. You can see the green line is the measured moisture content in the soil, and the orange or brown line is the modeled water content. And overall, we're using root mean square error as a way of estimating the accuracy. And so our accuracies are generally quite good. They range from 0.017 to 0.046 in terms of RMSEs. And I'm showing you the calibrated hydraulic conductivities for our simulations on the different soil textures. So a little bit of detail about the model that we're using. One of the complications that really nobody has been able to deal with in the past is this disconnected pervious nature, where you have rainfall falling on the panels and then dripping off. You have areas underneath the panels, however, that can infiltrate water. So our model actually accounts for those factors, and so we can route water from the panel edges down onto the soil underneath the drip edges. We can handle incident precipitation between the arrays. We can route runoff under the next downslope array and have infiltration there. And we can do this for a series of arrays and ultimately can calculate the amount of runoff that's accumulated at the bottom. We can also generate interesting videos, which take a lot of space, but I've just sort of provided you with some screen captures here, showing what happens for a 100-year, 24-hour storm on a sandy soil, that's the left, versus the same storm on a silty clay loam soil, that's on the right. And what you can see is there's a lot of vertical infiltration on the sandy soil, and that minimizes the amount of runoff. On the silty clay loam soil, you get more runoff and less vertical infiltration. And so, you know, that ends up meaning that there's more runoff at the bottom with the silty clay loam. So we used design storms for 2, 10, and 100-year return frequencies. And obviously the depth of the design storm depends on the location. So Georgia had the largest storms and Colorado had the smallest storms. And then the runoff that we get for our baseline would depend on the storm depth, the soil type, the soil properties that we actually are using for the models. And you can see a wide variation in the amounts of runoff by design storm, with higher runoff for larger design storms. You can see differences from one site to the other, where the silty clay loam has, generally speaking, more runoff than the other sites. The sandy loam soil has no runoff. Some of the sites have no runoff at lower design storms. So there's a lot of differences that we can sort of begin to see with our results. On average, if we just take the New York and the Oregon sites, which had runoff at all 3 design storms, the runoff increases about 160% for the 100-year versus the 2-year storm. So that's a pretty big increase. Next, we looked at the effect of vegetation. So in most of our sites, which we're calling the current pollinator, so this is the result that I had on the previous slide for the 100-year storm. We're able to adjust the soil hydraulic properties based on some literature searches or other kinds of vegetation. And as you get more and more mature, deep-rooted crops, we're seeing that the runoff goes down slightly. And if you compare, you know, runoff to what happens in a row crop, you would get slightly higher amounts of runoff. On average, the runoff from the row crop is about 38% higher than the runoff from the restored or mature prairie. And obviously the results differ quite a bit depending on which site you're at because of differences in soil and design storm intensities. We also simulated the effect of vegetation with and without arrays. So before construction, if you had pollinator habitat, for example, that would be your green results here. And then in comparison, you could look at the post-construction runoff with the pollinator habitat and the arrays. That's the rose-colored bars. And on average, the runoff increased only about 14% with the arrays relative to the baseline condition for the same vegetation without the arrays. So this is kind of important when you are thinking about how much runoff needs to be mitigated. We also could vary the array spacings, and all the study sites that we are actually working at have a center to center spacing of 25 feet, but we were able to look at other options from 15 to 35 feet. And as you increase your spacing, going from the green to the yellow, the amount of runoff goes down. And it's not a large reduction, it's only about 14% as you go from a 15 to a 35-foot spacing. Bulk density has a larger effect. And one of the things we realized very quickly is that maintenance activities post-construction and construction activities pre-construction, they do have an effect on the bulk density of the soil and on compaction. And so we saw quite a wide range in bulk densities at our sites, ranging from bulk density of 1 at some of the sites to bulk densities of about 1.6 at other sites, and those are in grams per cubic centimeters. So just looking at the effect of bulk density, you can see here that relative to our baseline condition, which is the blue bars, we could either compact the soils going on the red bars, or we could decompact or rip up the soil or scarify it to create lower bulk densities, and that would be the green bars. So basically, runoff increases by 98% on the more compacted soils versus the looser soils when we're doing the full sun array simulations. We also looked at what happens if you compact different areas, like under the drip edge, which is the light green bars, and ripping the soil under the drip edge didn't have a really large impact on our runoff. It decreased the runoff, but not too much. One thing that surprised us was that the depth of the soil really has a large impact on runoff. And this is something, again, that most evaluations are not really considering in great detail. So in our sites, we had some soils that were only 50 centimeters deep, other sites that were, 1.5 centimeters deep. I'm sorry, 150 centimeters deep, which is, something like 4 or 5 feet deep. So we changed the soil depth between 50 and 150 centimeters. And runoff increases as the soil depth decreases. So shallower soils are more risky from the point of view of runoff than deeper soils. And at the Minnesota site, we were actually surprised to see that even though it's a very sandy soil, if the soil profile was only 50 centimeters deep, it would generate a significant amount of runoff. Finally, I guess to put all this together, what I want to say is that a lot of evaluations of runoff at ground-mounted PV sites are based on the Nrcs runoff curve number method. So we decided to compare that method with our results. So the runoff curve method is the blue bars, and the orange bars are experimentally documented and verified runoff values. What you can see here is that runoff decreases on average by about 38% with the Hydrus method relative to the runoff curve number method. We only had one site where our method was higher, and that was New York, which is a very shallow soil and quite heavy texture. So at all the other sites, the runoff was quite a bit lower with our method. So to summarize, we've evaluated the Hydrus model across a range of sites. It performed very accurately, and we were able to sort of document the sensitivity of the model and the runoff to different factors. Some of the most important factors are how much rain is actually falling on the site. What's the design storm? Second most important factor is compaction. Third most important factor is soil depth. The next factor is the maturity or the rooting depth of the vegetation. And then the factors that have the least impact are the comparison between baseline versus having arrays or changes in the array spacing. So I guess what we're showing here is that if these kinds of factors can be considered before a site is actually designed, it may be possible to do a lot of mitigation of runoff by choosing the right vegetation, the right compaction level, making sure that the soil depths are adequate for the project, changing the spacing of the arrays. And so it's a lot of different ways other than putting in stormwater detention basins to mitigate runoff from stormwater runoff at these solar PV sites. And that's kind of the information we're trying to provide to people so they know what the factors are that need to be considered and by how much they might be able to mitigate runoff by, certain design or management factors at the site, other than just installing structural practices. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. And I suppose, Brian, what do you want to do about questions? Do you want to wait or just finish everything first?
Well, let's give people an opportunity if they wanted to kind of jump in now with questions to go ahead and ask them.
All right.
I don't see anything in the chat in terms of questions.
I have to go out of the full screen to actually see the chat.
Okay.
You can raise your hand or just talk. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think that it doesn't look like we have we have people asking questions. Oh, there's something in the chat that just came in there.
What did you notice about erosion on the drip line? Any need for BMPs there? Yeah, we do notice there's a trenching, that there's some soil loss. And so, spreading out the runoff from the drip edge could be a worthwhile practice, or using it for irrigation. Some people are doing that. If you have production of a agricultural crop or something of that nature at the same site. But overall, it didn't seem to be a major issue.
All right, anything else for people right now? Okay, well, you still have a chance to chime in later. I just wanted to note, I'll start sharing and kind of go through a few other things. I did want to note that the research that we've been doing, we actually discovered a researcher in Pennsylvania, Dr. Lauren McPhillips at Penn State, who was doing a very similar study, and she kind of co-presented with us at one of the conferences that we presented this work at, where she was measuring, and that's why I got her permission to use these slides here at this presentation. She was looking at the low impact development of solar farms in a more complex terrain than some of the sites we were looking at, because Penn State owns two facilities that she was set up instrumentation at. Looking at the kind of guiding questions that are here on the screen at their sites, and one of the kind of the characteristics here are that they're looking at much steeper slopes than what we had originally looked at in our sites. Up to 20 to 30% slope or variable slope. One site actually had an upslope parking lot at the top of the slope was a parking lot contributing to runoff, so a great deal of impervious surface already coming out and coming onto the solar farm, which was built onto the slope. They looked at and there was an underlying karst geology, which is also somewhat unique, and I don't know to what extent. I don't think we had too much of that particular kind of geology. They did also have a meadow vegetation, a pollinator or similar vegetation, in the array, but they had constructed infiltration basins and trenches. You can see circled on the kind of aerial picture of the site they were looking at, and so they said they both did soil moisture measurements as well as flow measurements into the infiltration basins and trenches to kind of see what kind of runoff they were going to get. They are still kind of doing a lot of this work and haven't completed or come up with recommendations. And they're going to be following up with some modeling scenarios and trying to measure some of the co-benefits of these sites. But one thing that Dr. McPhillips did note, that they, even with and I can't remember which storm it was, a hurricane remnant that came through Pennsylvania while they had everything set up, at the steep slope sites they were evaluating with 20% slopes, they actually measured zero flow coming off the solar farm itself into the retention basins, which was quite startling to them, because they did expect to see, of course, in a storm of that size, especially with impervious surface at the top. So you can see that there's actually a lot of variation, and we can't extrapolate too much from that. Probably because of the uniqueness of the site, but it does kind of put a bookmark in place about the opportunities that we might have for water quality control, even if there's a solar array in place. And that's kind of what I wanted to finish with here, is what we're actually doing with some of this research in terms of kind of evaluating what's happening in jurisdictions across the country, and what are some of the best practices that both regulators and solar developers should be looking at. We looked first at kind of what the existing practices were across the country in regard to how different jurisdictions from the local all the way up to federal, were examining and treating solar arrays and stormwater regulation specifically. And we focused mainly on post-construction stormwater regulation, but we did also attend to some of the other forms of water quality regulation that people are because solar farms are subject to as well. Some of the 404, 401 Clean Water Act standards, and there are some solar farms that are being developed in MS4 communities, and so some of the things that those communities would look at if we actually saw solar farms coming in. In the existing practices, as I kind of noted before, that the best practices had not been designed or tested for solar installations pretty much anywhere in the country. There was only one state, which is our actually home state of Minnesota, that had constructed a solar-specific model that they were using to evaluate. But even they were not basing it upon research that had been conducted on solar sites. We did note a variety of different post-construction and construction permit goals that were sometimes leading to what I was calling suboptimal water quality results because of just the way the different forms of regulation had been formed and were being implemented. We saw solar projects were facing sometimes dramatically different expectations and standards across state jurisdictions, but even local jurisdictions sometimes in the same county. We saw some significantly different standards that were being implemented at solar farms, where there were some cases some rather very expensive and excessive, well, we have since discovered excessive BMPs being required in some jurisdictions. But generally a lack of data-driven best practices about array design, layout, and site standards were minimizing our water quality that were leaving us with the inability to minimize our water quality risk and maximize benefits. And this was also true in the developers themselves. The practices they were using were also kind of rooted in some assumptions about impacts that probably weren't reflective of reality. So after we looked at the existing categories, we identified what barriers there were to solar installations in those, and we discovered that we had 4 categories, 3 of which were in the permit area, and 1 of which we kind of categorized as in kind of more of a BMP format, which would apply more to what the solar developers themselves were doing. The barrier categories we needed to kind of identify first off existing standards and best practices that weren't designed for or tested for solar installations, that we needed to start using solar-specific best practices as we were developing in this project. Looking at the kind of post-construction and construction different kinds of goals, we needed to kind of rejigger perhaps our regulatory processes and our permitting processes in order to get to optimal or improved water quality outcomes that were being missed. And also to try to solve cross-jurisdictional consistency so that different jurisdictions were using at least the same basic format for setting requirements for solar farms, so that in the marketplace we'd be getting transparent and predictable regulatory practices. The developers themselves needed to kind of develop and understand a menu of solar-specific best management practices, as Dr. Moeller just kind of described, recognizing that the traditional BMPs that we use perhaps can be supplemented with some of the other things, such as increasing the array spacing, making sure you're decompacting the soils and getting credit for that in the regulation, and maximizing the use and opportunities of different vegetation types. Actually, I'm going to skip this question because we didn't get set up for that. The best practices that we looked at, I just wanted to kind of distinguish in our guidance document that we came up with. We kind of broke those into best practices for regulators, which we referred to specifically as best practices, as opposed to BMPs, which is the term we use usually for solar projects. And we kind of use these kind of definitions of what a BMP is, and it's really a BMP being something that's taken by the permittee rather than the regulator. A best practice in our case was really looking at what the jurisdiction in terms of its permitting process would need to look at. And the goal of the PV Smart Work was really ultimately to reduce that balance of system soft costs in order to make sure that solar developments were facing a transparent and predictable future in stormwater regulation. But the best practices that we came up with, again, this is kind of, as we would call it, for the regulators themselves, is to use the solar-specific best practices, such as clarifying final stabilization standards in your post-construction stormwater regulations, where the use of, for instance, native or deep-rooted vegetation is actually discouraged in most states and most local jurisdictions because they take longer to establish. And so therefore the developer is more likely to choose a fast-growing, fast-establishing, fescue rather than a more native and deeper-rooted clumping kind of vegetation, even though in the long run, the latter of those gives you a better water quality outcome, as well as other co-benefits with the project, such as habitat and visual benefit, than you would get with the fescues. What the developers had noted that one of the things that was keeping them from doing those kinds of things was the fact that it took longer to get to that final stabilization standard. But there are techniques that a few places, including actually the state of Pennsylvania as a national leader in this, has already adopted to recognize that there are opportunities to get to final stabilization as long as you can provide assurance to the regulator that the final stabilization is going to happen with native and deep-rooted plants at some point in the future. You can demonstrate a plan for that. Second is on the encouraging your improved water quality outcomes, is to do your modeling to quantify the full water quality benefits, because there's actually opportunities when the soils are deep enough and the soils are not compacted to design your solar array and your ground cover in such a way that you can actually create a water quality amenity that exceeds the minimum requirements of regulation and permitting, but which can have a mitigating impact for surrounding land uses, particularly since a lot of these places where these are being developed are in rural watersheds where you have agricultural uses that are not subject to Clean Water Act standards and that have contributed to the impairments of a number of different waterways. So you actually have an opportunity potentially to create water quality amenities when the conditions are right and the design is right for these systems, and to kind of quantify that as we move forward in our permitting processes as well as in our designs. And then on cross-jurisdictional consistency, we have a best practices really, and this is directed a little bit more at the federal and the state entities and perhaps the regional entities such as the Southwest Pennsylvania Commission, to provide training for local officials on the scientific foundation for water quality regulation and solar farms so that we can actually capture the benefits and mitigate the risks. Some of the examples here that we have for permitting best practices are in our interim best practice document that is online and that you can access and described here, such as, again, removing those inadvertent barriers to co-benefit or multi-benefit ground covers on the final stabilization, which I've already described. But you can see it kind of just described, noted here in this page, this clip from our actual best practice guide. And then similarly, we look at what solar developers need to be able to do. And here's a list of 6 things that we're recommending that developers do more routinely, one of which is to practice site design for disconnection. They currently do array spacing and design solely on the basis of maximizing solar output, and that there are benefits to having them think also about what the design means in terms of maximizing the opportunities for disconnection in the site, so that they don't have to do other kinds of BMPs, provided the regulators are also acknowledging that. The green infrastructure approach is the one I just described, where you can actually maximize your use of opportunities and create water quality amenities, which provide local co-benefits to the host community as a means of mitigating perhaps some of the pushback that local communities have when they face, taking 1,000 acres of land and putting it into solar. Some of the neighbors or community members we've seen across the nation doing some pushback, partially because they don't realize that there are actually opportunities to get benefits for the host community. The importance of using low-impact development techniques, particularly around mitigating for soil compaction from the construction process through post-construction, and making sure that your array design is going to sustain your vegetative cover both between the arrays but also underneath the array. And this is something that goes directly in the long run to the kind of soil compaction issue and the viability of vegetative cover as a mitigating influence. And adopting, of course, some mitigation of runoff standards for some of the more challenging site conditions, such as the ones that the Penn State study is looking at, and to look beyond the design storm to where you can. This is something we ask the solar developers to consider so that you can actually provide additional co-benefits. Here is the website for our project hosted by the National Renewable Energy Lab. You can go to their site and get most of the documents that we're coming up with, as well as some other reference documents that we've compiled in the meantime. We will be posting more at this site, or at least referencing it here, as we finish the runoff coefficients and similar deliverables that Dr. Mola is working on, which should be due probably in this summer, maybe mid to late summer. We'll have those ready and accessible for water quality permit officials to be using. And that's the end of the presentation, and I will pause there and see if people have questions about any of the other material that we've just presented. I don't see anything in the chat, or anybody has their hand raised.
This is a topic probably for another webinar, but it would seem like solar panels on top of urban buildings is a more natural implementation of solar panels, since it's impervious anyhow. That also might help keep the roof cooler. So just a thought there.
Yeah, and we do a lot of work across the different kinds of solar deployments. So this is actually something that we've looked at. My organization, the Great Plains Institute. Obviously, if you're putting solar panels on top of existing impervious surface, there's no additional impact in terms of water quality for that, because obviously you're not creating any problems. But the irony that one of the things we want to point out that is somewhat ironic is that actually you can use solar farms that are going on to for instance, existing agricultural lands or other kinds of disturbed lands can actually improve the water quality outcomes that you see, because if you design the program or design the project to do better infiltration than the site that's already there, you actually can have a positive impact on things like impaired waterways. We're looking with a couple of states about actually doing water quality trading, where a community, an MS4 community, for instance, and this is actually not a water quality trade, but rather a BMP for the MS4. The MS4 could, instead of other forms of BMPs to improve for instance, the TMDL assignments and loadings that they have been assigned, they could do solar development on disturbed lands or on agricultural lands within the MS4 in the same water body, which would actually have the impact of improving the impairment. Most of it, some of the impairments anyway, for instance, things like phosphorus. So you actually have a potential benefit there it could be captured. But I will say that the other point that you raised about some of the benefits you might see on urban buildings, for instance, by putting solar panels on, you can actually reduce heat island effect in the building by keeping the sun off of the direct exposure to the building. That is a benefit that people looked at and that we have documented. So there is also a benefit to doing it on those other installations. And then finally, I'll just note that the form of solar development that we would see, for instance, on a rooftop versus the form of development that we see out in a solar farm are actually two different kinds of land uses and different kinds of solar development even. And they perform different functions within the larger electric grid. The solar farm is going to be a wholesale energy producer. A rooftop solar system is going to be one that is directly connected to a load on site, so it's kind of a retail application, and one that has different implications for the grid. So while they are both solar, they are not trade-offs for one another. You can't say, well, we should do one or the other. They're rather both satisfying different kinds of needs in the electric grid from a grid standpoint, as well as being very different kinds of land uses from the standpoint of the community and the host community. So that was a kind of a lengthy answer, and one that obviously I could probably go on at some length about, but hopefully I answered your question.
True, good point, yes.
Okay, we are about at time, so I do want to note that obviously if you have questions after this, we are still available for kind of answering them. I should have provided a direct link to the state of Pennsylvania's guidance on solar farms, where they have actually incorporated into the state guidance for the construction stormwater permit some of our research. So we presented to the state regulators in Pennsylvania, I don't know, maybe it was about a year ago, and in their most recent guidance, they actually incorporated the interim results of some of the things we're talking about into their guidance, so that they're actually leading the nation, I guess, in terms of kind of recognizing this particular research and providing opportunities for both the state regulators and local regulators to incorporate it. So, and Aaron, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything at the.
Hi. No, I just want to say a quick thank you to you, Brian, and also to David for presenting today. It was a lot of great information. As the region continues to shift and change, with different priorities, protecting water quality is always, one of our top priorities, and, becoming more energy independent and incorporating solar into different land use practices is definitely, going to help the region become more resilient in a number of different ways. So I just really want to take, just a minute and just say thanks again, and looking forward to potentially working with you some more in the future.
All right, thank you. And we will be providing the slides, and you'll be making them available to people?
Yes. They'll be posted on our website within the next few days. The video recording will also be available. So thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.